I am live. I am reading out of Time Out of Mind. It is the autobiography of Joan Grant, and it's an old copy. She lived 1907 till 1989, and she wrote books of her farm memories, her previous incarnation. And she wrote this book because a lot of people were asking about how she became this writer and how come she is so accurate in her descriptions. Chapter 2 of the third part of this book we are now, The Girl and the Twins. A winter drive through France would have been tiring for Malcolm, even if there had been room for the four of us and the luggage in Leslie's open Vauxhall. So we sent the car down to the villa with an RAC driver and went by the blue train. During breakfast in the restaurant car, Betty whispered, "Look, there's a honeymoon couple, the darlings." "How do you know?" I asked anxiously, hoping that while I was sharing a sleeper with her, she had not noticed the wedding ring pinned inside the breast pocket of my green satin pyjamas. She laughed. "Darling, you'll understand when you're married. I can always spot a honeymoon couple at 50 yards. La Motala was a perfect setting for a honeymoon, even with the bride and the bridegroom strictly incognito. There was a grove of ancient olive trees behind the Villa Olivier, a formal Italian garden, quantities of orange trees, mimosa and jasmine, and terraces of carnations striding down to the railway line and the sea. The drawing room was 20 feet high and hung with Herbert's paintings, in which Margaret and his three children, William, Mary and Anne, had been the models for various allegorical subjects. The one I most clearly remember was Mary in black draperies, disconsolately carrying a sickle, disguised as Ruth among the alien corn. The room had 6 French windows opening on a terrace, sentinelled by palm trees whose leaves rasped in the wind as though an army of swords were being drawn from rusty scabbards. Betty's room was large enough for an 18th century lutte de parade, and Leslie's I cannot remember, as discreetly I only went into it to do his unpacking. Malcolm's had a fine painted ceiling, speckled with black dots, which we later found out to have been caused by William Oliver's enlivening a sojourn in bed with the chickenpox by shooting moths and mosquitoes with an air pistol. And there was a magnificent marble staircase with finial turns which looked even better after I had filled them with branches of orange blossoms. I bought a whole tree from a farmer so as to get enough of it. My bedroom had curtains of rose-red damask and empire furniture, including a very genuine antique bed which had 2 lamps of life at the end of it and 2 bronze sphinx at the foot, so wobbly that they fell off with a crash at the slightest provocation. It was while Leslie was trying to put one of the sphinx on again that he said, "As a matter of interest, why did you tell me that you were an adulteress?" I felt myself blushing. "Oh, damn, I hoped you wouldn't notice. It made me feel such a fool." Virgins are proverbially foolish. Not as foolish as I am. I never realized I had such an appalling literal mind. I thought going to bed with a man and sleeping with a man meant just that. "But you must have read books." "Books? Scientific books?" I exclaimed bitterly. "Words like fallopian tubes and spermatoza are just words. I thought spermatoza crept out and crept in while both parties were asleep." He laughed until I was afraid that Malcolm or Betty would hear him. My first exercise in housekeeping was made easy by the 3 Italian maids who had been for years with Herbert. So all Betty and I had to do was the shopping, which gave us an excuse to gossip with the market women and buy quantities of flowers. To show father I was thinking about him, I sent him matchbox after matchbox of mosquitoes, the specimens neatly chloroformed and placed in cotton wool, together with the electrifying news that although as far as I could see without a microscope they were Culex pipiens, They were undoubtedly gorging themselves on my blood. He was delighted to receive these tributes of affection, but refused to accept my evidence. "See, Pipians," he wrote to me, "under no circumstances will bite human beings. It is presumed that they take their blood meal from birds. You will doubtless remember, if you can spare the time to think of such matters, that although Staley spent several days stripped to the waist in a cage of C. Pipians, none of them could be persuaded to bite him. This is scientific fact, so in future make your observations with more care." If he had only listened to me, he would have had a new subspecies, which my C. Pipians proved to be, named after him. But alas, this honour went a year later to an Italian entomologist. The smaller villa, where Herbert was living, lay between ours and the famous garden of the Villa Hanbury, which occupied the rest of the rocky headland, of which the foreshore was constantly patrolled by frontier guards. At first we smiled and tried to be friendly, but they were so unresponsive that we ignored them when we encountered them on our walks. A stony stare annoyed them even more than friendly overtures, and they tried to scare us away by tramping after us with bayonets at the ready, or by firing revolvers at seagulls. It was usually quite easy to avoid them, especially at night, for they made so much noise crunching over the rocks in their heavy boots, but one of them was caddish enough to stalk us in bare feet when we were sunbathing, which made Leslie very angry. Perhaps his anger was mistaken for guilt, as it must have been about then that they decided we were gold smugglers. This flight of fancy we only heard about after we had left, when Herbert saw our dossier, an impressive document in which I was described as the girl with the twins, embellished with a snapshot of me and two others of my accomplices, both of these being in fact snapshots of Malcolm, who never wore striped shirts nor Leslie's checked ones, a convention they had started while they were at Winchester. Ordinary soldiers were nearly as bad, little Mussolinis, who thought nothing of stopping at a GB car, ordering us to drive miles in the wrong direction and then striding off without bothering to thank us. After this had happened several times, we turned left instead of right out of the gates and drove nearly every day into France. The French customs men soon got to know us and waved us through without glancing into the car, but their Italian opposite numbers became increasingly surly. They charged us ridiculous high duty, even on a camembert or a loaf of bread, so it soon became a point of honour to smuggle at least one item every time we crossed the border. Betty had the highest score with 2 small melons tucked inside her blouse, which gained murmurs of "Que beau balcon" from the kindly French and the usual sneer from the Italians, until I inadvertently scored higher with 2 yards of bread and nearly landed us all in trouble. We were coming home late, having been to Monte Carlo to restore our nerves with a little gambling after a drive from Susper. Malcolm had wanted to see if he could average 50 miles per hour down the 30 kilometers of hairpin bends. He succeeded, for our guardian angels thoughtfully removed all the ox carts out of the way, so it seemed a pity not to see if we were equally fortunate at roulette, which we were not. We reached the border at about 3 a.m, and I was so sure that the Italians would be too sleepy to bother with us that only as a gesture I tucked the 2 long loaves up the sleeves of my fur coat. The men on duty were alert and suspicious. We insisted that we had nothing to declare, but they made us get out of the car, pulled out the seats, rummaged in the toolbox, peered into the engine, and finding nothing, sourly announced that before we could pass, we must be questioned by the commandante. The commandante was in bed, and in spite of our protests, we were marched into his room in the customs house. He was grossly fat, with a thicket of wiry fur poking out between the buttons of his grimy pyjamas. He yelled at us in very bad French, obviously furious that his orders had been too literally interpreted by minions who had disturbed his night's sleep. The main stream of his fury was directed at me. You and your confederates shall be punished, he shouted. Like a cat I have waited patiently at the mousehole, and now I shall pounce. We should be searched. We should be imprisoned. If we still refuse to confess, we should be shot. Pam, pam. For further emphasis, he brandished a revolver, which had been hanging in a holster from the brass bedstand. The crusty ends of the loaves dug into my armpits as I tried to push them even further up my sleeves. Then Betty's wild Highland blood went into action, her blue eyes blazing, her red hair fiery as her wrath. How dare he expose me, an innocent child, to the disgusting spectacle of himself in bed? How could I ever hope to recover from this shock to my sensibilities? He, the brute beast, the obscenity, the hairy murderer of a young girl's dreams, would be stoned to death by honest Italian women in the marketplace of Ventimiglia. And I, declared Betty, harking to the pipes of the stewards of Appin, I shall reserve to myself the right of casting the first stone. The bully wilted. The bully tried to cover his horrid chest by pulling up the blanket, which concealed all but the contour of his loathsome paunch. The bully cringed. Betty took the revolver from his shaking hand. For a fleeting second I thought she was going to put a mercifully bullet through the creature's brain. Then she threw it disdainfully into the corner of the room, wiped her fingers slowly and carefully on her handkerchief, dropped the handkerchief on the floor, and led us royally from the room. I tripped as I was getting into the car and dropped a loaf. One of the monster's henchmen leapt nimbly forward, saluted, picked up the loaf, dusted it, and with a low bow presented it to Betty. We had no further trouble with the customs. On Christmas Eve we gave a party and asked Herbert and Margaret and Mary, who had arrived the day before from England. We meant to announce our marriage after dinner, but I decided it would be more fun to tell each of them separately. Betty said, "Bless you, my darling children. Thank goodness I needn't feel guilty any more for being a spoilsport." Malcolm said, "Oh, so you've married Leslie? Bother, I meant to marry you myself. However, it doesn't matter so long as you are one of the family." Margaret rushed into the garden to bring me an armful of orange blossom. Mary, who had been my friend nearly as long as Diana, exclaimed, "Hooray, now you can help me bully the parents into letting me marry Sandy Sanders. They are being a bit sticky about it, because he has only his pay and has lost an arm, so they don't think he will be able to stay in the RAF." Herbert kissed my hand. My congratulations to the bridegroom, and my sincere apologies to the bride. I harboured unworthy thoughts about you, dear Joan, for soon after you arrived, my faithful Margarita told me that she had found one of the Signor Grant's pyjamas in the Signorita Marshall's bed. In loco parentis, it would have been my duty to speak severely to your seducer. Had I known which twin he was, he could say no more, for he was laughing too much. Chapter 3. Flatland. By the end of January, Malcolm had found comfortable bachelor's chambers in Half Moon Street, run by an ex-butler and his wife, a motherly old woman who promised to cosset him. We had been down to Seacourt and had a belated wedding reception in the music room, at which, for most of the time, Malcolm understudied for the bridegroom without anyone noticing the difference. When I could at last escape long enough to look for Leslie, I found him with Susan, Iris' younger daughter, playing houses under the dining room table. Quite unabashed, he explained that he had an acute attack of hearty nausea, and that Malcolm and he often acted as each other's stand-ins. Although they were identical twins, were treated exactly alike and went to the same school until at last they insisted on going to a rival university, they were in every other aspect totally dissimilar. If one liked a person, a play, a picture, the other was sure to disagree. This was not contrariness, but when I asked their opinion even of something as impersonal as a film or a book, they invariably took opposite views. However, one thing they shared, their affection for me and their opinion of their family. They became more informative about my in-laws after A.D. had cabled Leslie that he was to bring me out to the Argentine. "What's AD like?" I asked. "Pretty bloody," said Malcolm, and Leslie said, "You may be able to bounce him, which is more than any of us can do. What's your sister like?" "Oh, Elsie's all right," said Malcolm, "only I wish she wouldn't wear spats with a kilt when she's shooting. She's very good shot, considering she's a woman." And Leslie said, "She's a commandant of Girl Guides. So you'd better not let her know that you refused even to be a brownie." "What's Elsie's husband like?" "Ronald? Oh, he's the cheerful type. He can even get AD into a reasonably good temper," said Malcolm. And Leslie said, "You will like Ronald. He talks nearly as much as you do." "And your eldest brother?" They both brightened. "Duncan's is a thundering good chap. You won't see him, though, for he is on his way home to marry a girl called Margaret Birkin." "What is she like?" "I have no idea," said Leslie. "We haven't seen her. She went out to the Argentine and met the rest of us, so she will have had enough of the Grant family to go on with." "She might like to meet me. After all, daughters-in-law had better band together to protect each other from AD, I suggested. "But you are a Grant too now," said Leslie, which appeared to settle the matter. "And what about Babs? Is she a terrifying stepmother?" "Babs all right. She's a bit older than us and younger than Duncan," said Leslie. "She's Irish and a Roman Catholic. Not the emotional kind of Irish," she added hastily. "She does her best to keep AD genial, but of course she can't do much with him." And Malcolm, with a heartfelt sigh, said, "Poor Babs. Think of having father in the same country all the year round." As the day of our departure drew nearer, Malcolm treated me like a hospital nurse, cheering a patient on the way to the operating theatre. He went with me to choose my trousseau. Dress shops amused him and were dominated by Leslie, and encouraged me to buy dresses which would have been more suitable for a sophisticated woman of 30. He frequently implored me on no account to let myself be bullied by the Grants. I perched precariously on an emotional seesaw. Sometimes I was a child being outfitted for its first term at boarding school, and the next moment a knight getting several new suits of armour before setting forth to challenge a multi-headed dragon. On the 2nd February, Malcolm saw us off at Tilbury, and during the voyage I acquired more self-confidence. People on board liked me, so why shouldn't the Grants? My lovely new clothes were a success. I could dance the tango, I could play golf, I could play chess, I could play squash. Damn it, I would make them like me. When the Almeida Star steamed up the River Plate, I was still trying to decide what to wear for my first entrance in front of a critical, but what I hoped would soon prove to be an enthusiastic and appreciative audience. My final selection was a circular skirt and a long-sleeved bolero in white crêpe de chine from Calotte, very chic, and so suitable for a hot climate, as it allowed a cooling draught to play on the discreet glimpse of my bare midriff. With this, I wore a white felt picture hat with appliqued navy blue satin flowers, which I had bought in Paris, an enormous navy blue chiffon handkerchief, and high-heeled sandals. AD, with Elsie and Ronald in attendance, was waiting for us when the ship docked at Buenos Aires. My first glance showed me that the chief dragon was grey and spare and arid. He removed the pinnet from the bridge of his long, thin nose, polished it carefully on an impeccably clean handkerchief, and took a second look at me. He was tall, but I was tall enough to look him slap in the eyes which were cold and grey as a wet day in his native Scotland. "Well, you seem to have brought plenty of luggage," he remarked, and marched off, Leslie at heel, to the customs shed. Elsie, who also wore pince-nez, fired off a few hearty remarks of the "hope you had a decent trip" variety. Ronald beamed as though enjoying a private joke. I did not realize until later that, as neither Leslie nor I thought of giving my dossier in our letters to AD, my costume for Act 1, Scene 1, had confirmed their suspicions that Leslie had picked me out of the Gaiety chorus. We drove in silence to the Plaza Hotel, and after dinner went up to the sitting room of the suite, to sit on a stiff little gilt chairs round the central table, which supported a gilt basket of flowers with a label attached to the handle, emphasizing the point that it was a present to the bride from the manager of the Plaza Hotel. So far as I can remember, although I must be wrong, no one spoke a single word except Ronald, who did his best to help me by acting as combre to my feverish stream of chatter. It was midnight when he and Elsie returned to Hurlingham, the more than English suburb where they reigned. Adie opened a cupboard, brought out a bottle of whiskey, and said pointedly, "Leslie and I will have a nightcap before we go to bed." This was the cue for my exit, and I took it thankfully. For 2 hours I prowled up and down my bedroom through waves of gloom. In the troughs I was objectively apologetic for being such a ghastly failure. On the crest I quivered with self-pity and rage. At last the bedroom door opened to disclose a radiant Leslie. "Darling, you are marvellous," he exclaimed as he hugged me. "My clever, beautiful Joanne. No one has ever made such a hit with A.D. I've never heard him be so chatty. He positively sparkled." The next morning I thought it would be tactful to leave them alone together, so I went out to have a look at B.A., as I had already learned to call the city. B.A., Buenos Aires. Travel leaflets described it as the Paris of the South, but nearly 30 years ago it looked like a pastry cook's nightmare, and a pastry cook who could only dream in 2 dimensions, for while many of the buildings had facades which might have been modelled in icing sugar, the back and sides of them had dreary walls of muddy-coloured brick. I wandered along, looking into shop windows, especially the flower shops, and after following several side streets came to one where men were rather dismally standing in queues outside houses which looked too small for pubs. In most of the windows women were sitting, knitting, sewing, manicuring their nails, or listening to gramophone records. They looked friendly, so I smiled at several of them, and was annoyed that instead of smiling back they shouted at me in Spanish, which I could not understand. It even went so far as to grimace and put out their tongues. A nice-looking young man came up to me and took me by the arm. "I think you have lost your way, señorita," he said in quite good English, and began to hurry me along the pavement. "Leave me alone," I said crossly, for I dislike being hurried, especially by strangers. He tightened his grip. "I shall not leave you alone. You will come home with me. I have a very nice flat. We will have luncheon together." "My husband does not like me to lunch with strange men," I said primly, "and anyway, he's expecting me to lunch with him at the Plaza Hotel." He laughed, which I thought most discourteous. Did he think I was too plain to have a husband? "Then I will conduct you back to him, and tell him it is not sensible to let his wife go for walks by herself." "You will tell him nothing of the sort. I've never heard anything so ridiculous, and I'm not ready to go back to the hotel yet. I came out to do a little shopping." "Then I will come shopping too and carry your parcels. I can at least talk to the shop girls for you in Spanish." So I let him come with me. I thought that it would be good for him to learn that English women could not be bullied by impertinent foreigners. I bought gramophone records, silk stockings, toothpaste, and a rather gaudy tie, because my escort admired it, for Leslie. I gave it to the floor waiter the next morning, as it looked even gaudier when I examined it more critically. He bought me an enormous bunch of gladioli and insisted on carrying it as well as my parcels into the hotel. I introduced him to Leslie, and they spoke to each other in Spanish for a minute or two. Then he left, and Leslie said wearily, "For God's sake, don't let A.D. know that on your first day in the Argentine you got picked up in the red light district." The next day we went with A.D. to Rosario, and in the train I acquired further merit by beating him at chess. Babs was kind but preoccupied with the baby, who was fretful and delicate. There was a complete absence of the grey hidalgos I had expected to meet. We played golf every day, and I played well, Although the first time I got into the rough and turned around to see why my caddy was slow in handing me a niblick, I found he was using it to kill a snake. After that, I kept to the fairway. After about a week of this, A.D. drove us to one of his estancias, La Carlina, in the province of Cordoba. Mile after mile we drove through endless quantities of nothing. Nothing except wire fences every 1,000 meters, nothing except creaking iron windmills painted dried blood red, nothing except the bleached skeletons and skulls of hundreds of cattle which had failed to survive the first stage of their track to the meat-packing plants in Buenos Aires. I comforted myself with the thought that when we arrived at the estancia, I would find a luxurious Spanish home, perhaps a fountain in the patio where gauchos would serenade the bride and bridegrooms to the accompaniment of accordion and guitars. La Carlina, in fact, was almost frighteningly ugly. Frightening because how could I hope to understand a father-in-law who was exceedingly rich and yet so mean that he would not make his home even moderately comfortable? The ugly living room was in the middle of the house and lit by a skylight. The dried blood red of the creaking windmills was echoed in the wallpaper, on which were dozens of faded photographs, mostly of cows. But two of the photographs reassured me. One was of Leslie's mother, instantly recognizable as the woman I had seen in my dream, and the other of Leslie and Malcolm, taking them months before she died, with golden ringlets and white kid-button boots, with lace collars on their velvet suits, the clothes in which she had brought them to me. I knew she had been beautiful, sensitive, and gay. This was confirmed by the letters A.D. had received after she died, which were stuck into a purple velvet album displayed on a shelf under her photograph. It must have been A.D. who chose the hideous furniture, probably from a mail-order catalogue, for no woman of taste could have possibly done so. Except for the dreadful windowless room in the middle of the house, there was nowhere else to sit except a kind of veranda, but that was reserved for A.D. and his endless pounding on a portable typewriter. Every morning we rode before breakfast. It was too hot during the rest of the day, and every 1,000 meters we stopped to open a gate in a wire fence. The mosquitoes were so plentiful that a grey pony I rode was black with them, and every time I patted him there was a splotch of blood on his coat. I soaked my skirt with citronella, but there were still so many mosquitoes eager for English blood that this too was disgustingly blotched at the end of the ride. For the rest of the day we did nothing except play chess or piquet between meals and try to sleep through the worst of the heat. Even the herds of cattle seemed unreal. Money on the hoof, waiting to be converted into a different currency of racks of carcasses, tons of corned beef coffined in tins. Even the sky was drab as nickel coin. No cloud galleons, no radiant sunsets. Through the dusty air it looked like a steel blue lid clamped over the rusty pan in which we fried. Even thunderstorms were unfriendly. A raucous clatter of brass instead of gargantuan laughter, and a bolt of lightning was sly enough to hit the corrugated iron roof and hurl me out of bed, while it left A.D. sleeping peacefully on the other side of the house. I was only there about a fortnight, though it seemed much longer. A.D. had promised to pay for a honeymoon trip to the Andes, or by riverboat up the Pirana to see the Iguacha Falls. But when it came to the point, he said it would be just as nice for us and much cheaper to visit Elsie. Hurlingham was far, far better than La Carlina, but everyone I met there was Scottish or English, and the club, which was the hub of their existence, was an imitation of the original one on the Thames. The houses were steadfastly mock Tudor, with English gardens, pallid mignonettes, and sad little sweet peas, instead of hibiscus, bougainvillea, and 1,000 other exotic shrubs which could have flourished there. The men did not actually stain their bodies with woad, but they trotted off to catch the city train wearing stiff collars and 6 spare ones in their attaché case to change into as they wilted in the heat, to protect themselves from being mistaken for soft-shirted Argentines. The women gossiped about servants, about club activities, about each other, and about me. The more Elsie tried to defend the honour of the Grants by declaring that Leslie had not found me in the chorus line, the less she was believed. But her clothes, dear, the dress she wore at the club last night was practically naked, said a lady, looking smugly down at her modest V. Chorus girls never play games, countered Elsie desperately. Ah, but she has to. All that golf and squash is necessary for a woman who is quite blatant about not wearing corsets. All this, though tiresome in many ways, had one advantage. At the club Saturday evening dances, the gentlemen could hardly wait to foxtrot with me to the gramophone, and when my feet were sore from being trodden on, I remembered how much worse it had been to be a wallflower in a pink dress at my first hunt ball. But I never got the chance of dancing a tango with an Argentine. Then Ronald came to our rescue and got us invited on a director's inspection tour of the railway south of Buenos Aires. The special coaches might have been rooms in a St. John's Wood villa of Victorian England, except that they had proper bathrooms. There were brass bedsteads, fireplaces with china dogs at each end, and the mantelpiece red plush curtains with bobble fringe, Axminster carpets, cake stands, beaded footstools, a decor which provided the background for my 21st birthday party, with an iced cake and candles and lots of caviar. Apart from the absence of any scenery, almost the only snag was skunks. When annoyed by the intrusion of the train, they fired at it or else got run over, and the stink was so appalling that several times I was out of bed and retching over the basin before I was properly awake. We were south of Bahia Blanca before I saw real trees. Lombardy poplars planted as windbreaks to fruit farms, mostly apple and grapes. Most of the fruit farmers were Italian settlers, and we went to one of their homes. There were ruffled cotton curtains at the windows of the little box-like house. Morning glories had been trained over the corrugated iron roof, and there were rose-colored grapes hanging from the trellis over the doorway. They gave us wine and laughed and chatted when they had got over their first shyness. They were very poor. They had 3 small children and were obviously soon going to have more, and they were very busy putting down roots. They were not alien to the land where they were living. After so much flatness, I was thirsty for mountains. When we were within 2 hours of a point where, so everybody told me, I should get the most magnificent view of the Andes that could be seen anywhere in the Argentine, the chairman decided that he would prefer to spend the night in a siding and retrace our tracks the following morning. My only consolation was that when his coach was being shunted so that it could occupy the place of honour at the end of the train, it toppled off the line and he out of bed, hurting himself quite badly. On my way back to BA, I decided that I had more than enough of the Argentine. Our passage home had been booked on the Royal Mail steamer Alcantara at the end of May, so we should be stuck for another 6 weeks unless I could finance my alternative plan. Fortunately, several rich and silly old men patiently explained to me the rules of poker without asking whether I had played the game before. When I had 4 kings, my lip trembled, and when I had a pair of 2s, I bounced with excitement, and by the time we left the train, I had won just enough money to go by ourselves to Brazil. So this is the end of chapter 3 of the 3rd part of Time Out of Mind.